to this episode of the Rise to Reign podcast. I'm your host, Amy Killingsworth, and I'm super excited about this one because it is all about trauma. Now, trauma is not an exciting or fun or happy subject to talk about. However, if and when you begin to understand trauma and that everybody has it to varying degrees stored in your body and your central nervous system, it will truly change and revolutionize your life. And when you begin to recognize and meet and heal the trauma, it truly 100% changes the way that you show up and the way that other people experience you and the way that you live and your quality of life. So let's get started. Okay, so like I said, every single person has experienced trauma. Every single person. Now, why do I say that? Well, the reason is because to a child, the world is a big, scary place filled with big, loud people. So think about, like as a child, think about like a 3-year-old and then maybe the dad who's 6 foot tall and has a booming voice. And as adults, we're habituated to that. But as a child who's fairly new on the earth, or maybe even a baby, these people are huge and they're loud and everything is unknown and scary. And so children have no frame of reference through which to process their experiences. Most of what happens to a child, especially in early childhood, is brand new. Think about that. Every single thing that happens the first time in childhood is the first time it's happening. And so it's very uncertain. Childhood, we forget this, but childhood is a very uncertain time. Big, loud, scary world. So trauma occurs in 2 ways. There's the obvious event. So the event that is so scarring, like it's seen or experienced with a high degree of emotional activation. So this is fear, sorrow, etc. And one thing I want to point out here is that trauma is patterned into the central nervous system based on perception. So if you look back with your adult eyes and think, oh, that wasn't that big of a deal, you're kind of rationalizing with your mind that it wasn't that big of a deal. But when it happened and when it was imprinted into the central nervous system, it's based on perception. So it's based on how that child or even that adult experienced that situation, whether it was objectively scary or dangerous or not. A great example of this is like, let's say that I've done this to my children. So I'll do it from like the mother's perspective. Let's say that you're at, the grocery store and the child wanders over and is looking at something in the cookie case. And I'm watching him the whole time. I've got my eyes on him. I might be doing something else, but I know where he is. And then he looks around and doesn't see me and starts to panic. And, he starts to look around and in a panicked state. And so when I get his attention, he says, he's crying and he's hysterical and he thought he was lost. Well, he was never lost. I had my eyes on him the whole time. But the trauma, the adversely experienced event, has been patterned into the nervous system, how he experienced it. So even though he was never in objective danger, he subjectively experienced danger because he thought he was in danger, if that makes sense. That's a really minor example. But, there's traumatic things that happen in our lives that make a huge, dramatic, traumatic impression. The other way that trauma is patterned is by the everyday situations that we experience with regularity. So an often repeated experience that creates the feeling of uncertainty or fear. This could be, like just the fact, something simple like the fact of like parents fighting in the home. And one thing that really creates a traumatic imprint is intermittent reinforcement. So like the walking on eggshells dynamic. Is dad going to be happy? This happens a lot in alcoholic homes. Is dad going to come home and is he going to be nice? Is dad going to be happy? Or is he going to be enraged? Am I going to be loved or am I going to be punished and rejected? So obvious examples of the dramatic events are death, abuse, events, abusive events, abandonment, accidents, divorce. Less obvious examples of trauma could be discipline that involves shame, embarrassment, or physical violence. The birth of a sibling can be traumatic. Now, remember, this is really key. Trauma is patterned based on perception. So, everybody around may be thinking, hey, this is such a joyous event. The baby's born. This is wonderful. But to the child who's been an only child for 3 years, their whole world's crumbling. And here comes this, this interloper. And is there going to be enough love to go around? And am I going to lose attention? And, like to a child, especially a young child, that can be very, very traumatic because it creates that sense of uncertainty. Okay. So bullying is a huge trauma instigator. Being lost or separated from parents, being left with a teacher or caregiver of which you are afraid, parents fighting, illness, inebriated family member. So the earliest and most often repeated experiences in childhood lay the foundation for a child's perception of the world. So remember, again, I'm repeating myself, but this is so critical, that patterning is based on perception. So the child's self-perception, what they perceive inside themselves, creates the subconscious rules a person will play by for their entire lives. So whether or not people are safe, whether or not money is abundant, whether or not God is angry, the things that we perceive as children create the unconscious or subconscious rules that we play by throughout life. Okay, so it's very common for children with parents who were addicts to become people pleasers because they were constantly enabling and playing the rescuer or, tiptoeing eggshells around their alcoholic or drug addicted parent. So don't get stuck. This is a point I really, really want to make. Don't get stuck minimizing traumatic wounding because you're comparing it to others who had it much worse. So a lot of times we look back on our childhood with adult eyes and we think, it was happy. It wasn't that bad. I was loved. I was safe. I had, a roof over my head. But it depends on how you experienced it. And the bottom line is if there's trauma in your nervous system, then it's causing problems. It's causing you problems, whether you had a happy childhood or not. Nobody had a perfect childhood. So sometimes we'll look at people in war-torn countries or people who are refugees or, make these harrowing journeys, or children who are abused or neglected or abandoned, and we think, well, I didn't have it that bad, so I'm not traumatized. But traumatic experiences are subjective and problematic until uncovered and healed, period. So if you have big major trauma, or if you have what might be considered simple trauma, is trauma. And comparison works against the process of acknowledging and healing. So I want to talk about something that I call stakes in the ground. So these are moments that are critical on development. So not necessarily in obvious and flashy ways, but in fact, they may not feel significant at all. So what is a stake in the ground? Well, stakes in the ground are formed primarily by experiences that induce fear or uncertainty, especially if those experiences were repeated. So adversely perceived events experienced repetitively in early childhood are the primary way that our patterns, our emotional patterning, our personality, our style of relating, our sort of, quote unquote survival mode is formed. So you can't, I say this all the time in coaching, you can't find the light by investigating the darkness. So unlike behavioral therapeutic approaches like talk therapy, the Rise to Rain method works within triggers in real time to activate the trapped emotion and process it out. So the way that trauma is laid down is when you're experiencing that fear, it's usually fear that creates trauma, and the other things come later, like the sorrow or the anger come later, but it's usually fear. Like that heightened emotional state is where trauma is recorded. And so when you're experiencing that, it sort of gets like frozen in time because you lack the tools as a child usually, and even as an adult if the trauma is significant enough to process it in real time. So you stuff it and it stays buried. Feelings buried alive never die. So the way that we work within Rise to Reign is what I call somatic coaching, and it's a proprietary method of somatic coaching and a community healing model where we work in real time to activate that emotion and process it out. You have to feel it to heal it, and that freaks a lot of people out because they don't want to feel. They're afraid of their feelings and they're afraid of experiencing that. But the amount of energy that it takes to keep that down is enormous, and the amount of energy that it takes to feel it and process it out is much smaller compared to the combined energy that it takes to keep it at bay, to keep it covered. The addictions, the numbing, the relational problems, the cost of unhealed, unfaced trauma is very, very, very high, and we see it playing out in our individual lives and in our culture as a whole. So something that, I always say is you can't investigate, or you can't find the light by investigating the darkness. So we don't go looking for trauma. We don't go digging for memories. Usually it's enough to work within the emotional energy itself. So the way a trigger works is when you experience a heightened emotional experience now, it will connect. It'll imagine a wire from this button to this trigger, from this experience to this reaction. And when that button is pushed, it activates this emotion. And it's really not about what's going on right now. It's actually what happened back here. I'll give you an example of this in my own life. So I do CrossFit. You guys have probably heard me talk about that. And for a very long time, I had this block where if my heart rate would get too high and my respiration, my breathing would get too labored, I would start to panic, like almost hyperventilate. And so because of that, I could never really push myself enough to get to like the next level in my workouts. And so because I do the work that I do, I was like, what is that about? Because it felt a little bit less than, like, the reaction felt extreme to the stimulus, and that's your first clue. I always say, like, if it's hysterical, it's historical. I didn't come up with that. I heard it somewhere, but I don't remember where. But if it's hysterical, it's historical. And so when you find yourself overreacting, which we don't like to use that word because it minimizes your experience, but when you find yourself reacting, having your reaction be really bigger than the situation, that's your first clue that you're dealing with a trauma. So I sat down and I went through the process of investigating that feeling and really did some work around going into that heightened emotional state. And if there's a memory there and it needs to surface, you can trust your subconscious under the guidance of the Holy Spirit to bring that to your memory. And what it was for me was when I was about 7 years old, and I remember this, but I hadn't thought about it consciously for years and years and years until I did this process. But we lived on a lake, and we would always go out on the boat, and we would go water skiing and kneeboarding. And I was about 7 years old, and I was learning to kneeboard. So my dad's friend who had a son was helping me learn how to kneeboard, to wakeboard. And he was behind the boat with me, and I was 7, and he was like maybe 15 or 16, big guy. And he had me on, like, sort of laying down on the wakeboard, and he was behind me. And he was, kind of just there to help me make sure that I didn't get hurt. And the water would, like, the boat would start up, and then you would sort of wiggle up and put your knees in the strap. That's how they worked back then. And so he was there to help me, and he was a, nice guy, and he was really trying to be helpful, but he was laying on top of me as the boat began to go, and his weight shifted, and my rib cage was pressed up against the wakeboard, and he was on top of me, and then the nose was sort of making spray come up at my face, and I couldn't breathe. And so there was this moment of what seemed like a lot of moments strung together. It wasn't very long, where I couldn't get breath, and I was panicking because I couldn't breathe. And that's the same feeling. It only lasted for a few moments because somehow I got his attention and got him to shift off of me. And I got my breath and I was fine. But I never thought of it again. But that moment where I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to die. Like I was 7. Oh my gosh, I'm going to die. That was patterned into my nervous system. And here I am. I'm going to be 47, 40 years later, and it's affecting my workouts. This is how this works. And so if you don't do the exploration, you're just like, oh, I'm lazy, or you form all of these beliefs or meanings about yourself of why you can't or why you're not doing what you want to do, or why you can't grow, or why you can't get past something, or why you can't have a certain level of money, or why you can't get that promotion, or why you can't find and sustain love, or whatever it is. And the reason is there's a reason. There's always a reason. And the reason is trauma, and the solution is healing. Okay, so that, my friends, wraps up this episode on understanding trauma. Of course, that's definitely not a deep dive. That's just a sort of a primer on trauma. But once you begin to understand trauma, and once you begin to accept it, you can start to acknowledge it, and you can start to heal it and process it out. All right, my friends, thanks so much for listening. That is it for this episode of the Rise to Reign podcast. I'll see you next time.